Let's start with the escalating situation in Victoria. There are calls from the Australian Medical Association to be having a royal commission into what's happening there. Tony Passon, would you support that?
Well, Annalise, one thing's clear. There is an unfolding calamity in Victoria. Right now, I think the focus needs to be on getting on top of that particular situation. But I think, to be truthful, at some point there will need to be a very close examination, one with perhaps all the powers of a royal commission to find out exactly how one jurisdiction in this country got it so desperately wrong.
The concern from those calling for it is that these mistakes could be continuing to be made. Matt Thistlethwaite, do you think that that's a call for having the Royal Commission now?
Well, Annalise, in terms of the issue of quarantine and security in Victoria, there is an inquiry going on, and the proper thing to do is to await the findings of that. And if there are recommendations made, obviously the government will assess those and put in place measures as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, it isn't confined to Victoria. We've had outbreaks in other states as well, where there have been breakdowns in communication and the like. The Ruby Princess, Newmarch House in New South Wales, you had a situation of an outbreak in the north of Tasmania. The medical experts have always said that you're going to get these situations. It's the nature of the virus and the rate of infection and the spread of it. What's important is that governments accept the advice of medical experts and put in place measures and act as quickly as they possibly can to control those outbreaks. And so far, I think in Victoria they're doing the best they can. In other states we've been doing a pretty good job of that. What's important is that we try and remain united and work together on these issues and not try and score political points off each other, because at the end of the day we're all Australians and we've all got to get through this together.
One of the calls in Victoria at the moment is to have the students in Year 11 and 12 who are still allowed that face-to-face learning to have that called off. That's come from the Education Union. Tony Passon, do you think that Year 11 and 12 students in Victoria should be going back to online learning?
Well, Annalise, firstly, I feel for Year 11 and Year 12 students in Victoria and the uncertainty around a very delicate stage of their education. The reports I've read this morning, and bear in mind it's very difficult from the relative comfort of South Australia to project yourself into the Victorian situation, which I think is fair to say is very different to the outbreaks that have occurred or are occurring in other jurisdictions, just by dint of the sheer volumes, which I think does say something about how the respective outbreaks have been handled. So it's very hard to project yourself into that situation from, as I say, the relative comfort of South Australia. But what I will say is, on reading the reports this morning, it seems to be a breakdown in the systems around how we deal with outbreaks in schools that the principals are most concerned about. I think the reality here is every effort should be made to allow Year 11 and Year 12 students to continue with their education as normally as possible. And part of that should be very good and sophisticated systems around circumstances when there is a case of COVID-19 in a school. Now, from what I've read this morning, that doesn't seem to be the case. And that's not a failure on the part of the principals, but rather the Victorian health systems that ought to be wrapping around these schools and doing everything they can to make sure these students continue their face-to-face learning. They're making very significant concessions to make sure that happens because of the very significant importance of those years and this stage of their educations.
And as you say, the advice consistently has been that it is safe to have schools open, but it's that managing the outbreaks when they do happen that is proving to be a challenge. Matt Thistlethwaite, do you think this has been mishandled by the Victorian Health Department?
Well, I think that the Victorian Health Department is acting on the advice of the medical experts. Obviously, the Principals Association that have put out that statement today have got the welfare of the students and their staff in mind. What's important, I think, is that where you do have positive cases, that the school shut down quickly, that there's a deep clean, and that students don't return until it's safe to do so. That's the practice that appears to have worked well throughout the country, that's been adopted by the National Cabinet, and that's the practice that's been put in place in Victoria. So I'm not going to criticise the Victorian health officials when they're following the guidelines that have been agreed to through the National Cabinet and that appear to be working as best they possibly can.
And as you mentioned before, Tony Passon, I think we're all quite grateful we're not in Victoria right now because things are looking really tough there, in particular in their aged care homes. We've heard some pretty horrific stories about family members passing away quickly, not being able to visit each other. Tony Passon, do you think we should have acted sooner on these aged care homes to stop people working across different facilities when they are the big risk?
Well, Annalise, you're right when you point out that the real issue right now, not just in Victoria, but is the fact that this disease has broken effectively lines into aged care facilities throughout Victoria. I think that speaks to how well other jurisdictions have managed this disease in the first incarnation and any subsequent or second wave, and I think we should pause to just think about how well that's been managed in other jurisdictions. In terms of where we are now in Victoria, the federal government is leaning in significantly, providing additional funding to ensure that people don't need to work across multiple sites, that people who can't work for dint of perhaps the reason that they're in a higher risk category can be supported at home. Additional staff are available. I'm very concerned with what's unfolding in Victoria, particularly given I live a pitching wedge from the Victorian border. My communities are very, very aware of the issues that are unfolding. And Annalise, I'm really concerned that what we've seen here, or what we're seeing, is a breakdown of systems across the board, whether it's how you shut down and clean schools, how you keep this disease out of aged care facilities, which means that we're ultimately in a situation where very many Australians will lose their lives in circumstances where they ought not to have.
That extra pandemic leave for aged care workers that you mentioned has been really welcomed across the board. The question is, should it have been done sooner? Matt Thistlethwaite?
Look, Annalise, I think it probably should have. The Fair Work Commission's decided that anyone that works in an aged care facility should have access to paid leave. So particularly if they feel unwell, there's not a financial disincentive for them not turning up for work. What's important, I think, is that the Commonwealth regulates aged care. They need to get across what's going on not only in Victoria but across the country, particularly in the wake of Newmarch House. So what's really important is ensuring that there's adequate personal protective equipment in these facilities, and the Commonwealth should be involved in auditing that. The paid leave is very important, ensuring that people aren't working between facilities. But the one area where I don't think we're getting it right is in consultation with relatives. And you've seen images in the media of the anxiety that's been generated by relatives who can't get information about their loved ones in these facilities by ringing up or going online. And I think that the Commonwealth needs to be aware of that, the regulator, and try and work with the facility providers to put in place mechanisms to ensure that that information is freely available, and it removes the need for people to show up at these facilities and increase the risk of infection.
And just finally, the Black Lives Matter rallies are kicking off again in Sydney today. It might be scuppered by bad weather, but Tony Passon, should people be going to this rally?
In one word, Annalise, no. This is potentially one of the most selfish things I've ever seen. This cause obviously is one that the individuals are very passionate about, but all I ask is that they express their passion at this point in a different way. There will be an opportunity to rally in large numbers at some point in the future. It's just not the right time now, and in doing so they're putting Australian lives at risk. And as I said, you know, it's not a word I rush to, but I think this is, quite frankly, very selfish behaviour.
Matt Thistlethwaite, do you agree? Is it selfish?
Well, I've got a lot of sympathy for the family of David Dungay and their search for justice, Annalise. He died in horrific circumstances at Long Bay Jail, but I agree with Tony that people should not be attending this rally today and defying a court order. I think as an alternative, what the organisers of this rally should be looking at is seeking an urgent meeting with the Premier and the relevant ministers to sit down with them and try and discuss some of these issues that have been raised through these protests, particularly around Aboriginal deaths in custody and the rates of incarceration, and try and work with the government to put in place procedures to ensure, firstly, that you don't get a repeat of what happened to David Dungay in any facility throughout the country, but secondly, we try and reduce this shocking rate of incarceration.
Do you agree with Tony Passon, though, that attending is selfish?
I agree that people shouldn't attend the rally. They shouldn't defy the court orders. I'm not going to second guess people's motives for why they're doing it, but they do need to think of others. And the court's determined that it's not appropriate for this rally to take place on this sort of day in these circumstances, and people should abide by that.
Matt Thistlethwaite, Labor MP, and Tony Passon, Liberal MP, thank you both for your time.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Annalise.
Annalise.